All right, we will go ahead and get started. Uh, a big chunk of the Rime Sparse tonight, actually 126 through 214. Um, but of course we're going to look at like 10 or 12 poems total. In this third lesson, what we see in this part of the Rime Sparse is a continuation of what we've had before, but with a sense of not urgency, because urgency is never quite the right word for Petrarch, but a recognition of the failures to move ahead. He has these loves that are pulling him in different directions, um, and that he knows are not the proper loves, or rather that they're not properly ordered. Um, We'll remember that Petrarch is a great reader of Saint Augustine, and the idea of having properly ordered loves based upon the status of what we love in terms of its relationship to God. Um, Augustine is very clear on that in almost all of his works, that only the creator can be absolutely loved for what it is. Everything else it serves a purpose of bringing us to God, or we have a role of bringing it to God, but only God can be absolutely loved for what it is. And so Petrarch, knowing that, still has the love for Laura, that appears in poem after poem, but more increasingly also the love of glory. Um, the desire to be famous in his own day, and he was already famous in his own day uh, by the time he was in his 30s. He was acknowledged as the greatest poet in Europe while he was in his 40s. But the desire to have not just fame in your own life, but to have your name live throughout history. Uh, in the classical world, that's what immortality was. They had no notion of salvation in our sense. But the idea of having immortality by having your name resound through history was what could be desired. Um, Certainly not their own invention, but Petrarch picked it up there. And that is very much at odds with all of the Christian message. And Petrarch knows that, but can't quite get over that. So one of the things that we look for in the poems tonight is the fractured self, the divided self, the fragmented psyche. Uh, that comes to the fore in these poems as it hasn't before previously. But let's go ahead and begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve Radix, Salve Porta, ex qua mundo lux est orta. Gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa. Vale, o valde decora, et pro nobis Christum ex ora. Hail, O Queen of Heaven, hail, O Lady of Angels, hail, thou root, hail, thou gate from whom unto the world a light has arisen. Rejoice, O glorious Virgin, lovely beyond all others. Farewell, most beautiful maiden, and pray for us to Christ. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So I had this as the last poem in last week's lesson, but we didn't have quite have time to get to it. We start off tonight with a series of canzoni, and the canzoni again are the longer, deeper poems. The sonnet in 14 lines, there's only so much even Dante or Petrarch can do. But in the canzone, simply with the amount of space that you have, um, and I managed to not put the screen on again. Um, Thank you. My apologies, 2 weeks in a row. And I completely forgot where I was at. Oh well. Oh yeah, so we're in a series of canzoni. They're the longer poems with more lines. The poet has the ability to develop far deeper scenes. And the way that Petrarch structures the rime sparse is to have long groups of sonnets, sometimes 7, 8, 10, sometimes 30. And these are interspersed with different genres of poetry here and there, a sestina here. The canzone usually appear in groups, and they aren't just grouped in terms of like chronological order or what they tell in the story, but they're also grouped thematically. And one of the great innovations that Petrarch's making in his poetry is that when just a collection of poems had been presented before, it was always divided up by genre. So you'd have all of the sonnets and then all of the canzoni, and then if you had ballate or madrigals, those would all be together in their own little groups. Dante had in the Vita Nuova, the New Life, changed that up a bit, but he had also put text in between. So it wasn't just a poetry collection. There was explanatory text in between the poems that proceeded very clearly along a narrative line. Petrarch's kind of combining both. There's clearly a narrative sense that runs throughout the Rime Sparse, but it's not so strong that it's unavoidable. You look for it, you see it develop over time, but there's many sections in which it seems that you just have some poems that just kind of seem to go together, some poems that just kind of don't. You have to look for the narrative in that. So when he's putting these together, it's generally in a chronological order and generally along this narrative story. But the way that the canzoni are organized when they're put next to each other also reflects the earlier bit of arranging things sort of just by style or content. And these poems, 126 and then 127 and 129, these are all poems, the love from afar. That is, he is not present in Avignon or in Vaucluse anymore. He's in Italy. He's one of his trips to Italy. 128 makes it clear that this was a stay in Milan. And so while he's writing in Italy, he's hearkening back to his memories of Vaucluse, which is an area, it's this area very close to Avignon, but this kind of rustic, bucolic, good poetry setting that Petrarch always considered to be home. And so while he's departed from Vaucluse, he goes back in his memory there. And in his memory, he's also haunted by Laura. So chiare, fresche, dolci acque, ove le belle membra pose colei, che solo a me pardonna. Gentil ramo, ove piacque, con sospir mi rimembra, a lei di fare al bel fianco colonna, erbe e fior che la gonna leggiadra ricoverse, con l'angelico seno, aere sacro, sereno, ove amor co begli occhi il cuor me perse, date udienza insieme alle dolenti mie parole estreme. So this beautiful, majestic opening where he's painting this picture of what is in medieval poetry called a locus amoenus, a lovely place that if you're going to have in the Middle Ages any kind of love scene at all, it needs to occur in the proper place, which is either an enclosed garden that allows you to think that you're not in the city, or it's out in nature somewhere where there's running water. That's important. You have to have little, wrestling brooks, streams, or fountains. And then, of course, you have to have the appropriate trees and flowers because there's some trees are appropriate to love settings and some others aren't. And what Petrarch does here is rather than just setting this scene, he's addressing his poem to these parts of the scene. The clear, sweet, fresh water. All of you listen to these, my last sad words. Le dolenti mie parole estreme. there's a sense of foreboding death that we've seen in some poems before, but announces itself very strongly in these poems. And of course, for Petrarch, who is deeply religious, this foreboding sense of death carries with it the increasingly urgent message of reform your ways and turn to God alone. Um, and the struggle, of course, is Petrarch's inability to do that. Sceglie pur mi destino, al ciel in ciò s'adopera, ch'amor quest'occhi lagrimando chiuda, qualche grazia il meschino corpo fra voi ricopra, e torni l'alma al proprio albergo ignura. La morte fia men cruda se queste spene porto a quel dubbioso passo, che lo spirito lasso non poria mai in più riposato porto, né in più tranquilla fossa fuggir la carne travagliata e l'ossa. Um, and that image there of coming into harbor, which is always metaphorical for preparing for the good death. Death would be less cruel if I could bear this hope to the uncertain crossing, the dubioso passo. The dubioso passo, it has a stronger sense than the uncertain crossing. Uncertain here, if you load it with an eschatological sense, that uncertain in terms of his eternal fate, his salvation, that is dubioso. Literally, doubtful would be the cognate, but not quite that either. Tempo verrà ancor forse, ch'all'usato soggiorno torni la fera bella e mansueta. And just that phrase, la fera bella e mansueta. La fera is a wild animal. But it's a beautiful wild animal. And mansueta, not just gentle, but cultured and yeah, I can't come up with a better translation off the top of my head. It's a word that's used in courtly culture to define somebody who is refined. So gentle in the sense of like chivalric manners. So how you are both a wild animal and mansueta. We're starting to come into the contradictions that just dominate this sense of or this part of the collection of poems. E la vela mi scorse nel benedetto giorno, volga la vista disiosa e lieta cercandomi, e oh pietà, già terra in fra le pietre vedendo, amor l'ispiri in guisa che sospiri sì dolcemente che mercé m'impetre, e faccia forza al cielo, asciugandosi gli occhi col bel velo. And here we have the memory of seeing Laura and going and with the Augustinian sense that Petrarch always has with him. You're also bringing in the passage of time and what time is. And in his memory, he's going back, while in his imagination, he goes forward. And he remembers seeing Laura in this place in the past and imagines a future when she comes back here where she saw him that blessed day and finds his corpse, sees his grave, sees him already earth among the stones. And then love will inspire her that she'll sigh for him. And it starts off almost as pathetic that, the imagination of, oh, she'll miss me then. But then it turns into something much better than that. Si dolcemente che mercé m'impetre. That her sighs for him will have power in heaven, that her sighs for Petrarch will move God and obtain remittance in purgatory for him, is what he's literally imagining. And just the combination of factors in a love song to have the beloved who has always ignored you in life. Imagine her coming and seeing your grave and being so sad about it, and then making this turn that her sorrow at the grave will be so sincere and heartfelt, that it will obtain for Petrarch God's graces. Da bei rami scendea, dolce nella memoria, una pioggia di fior sovra il suo grembo, ed ella si sedea umile in tanta gloria, coverta già dell'amoroso nembo, qual fior cadea sul lembo, qual sulle trecce bionde, coro forbito e perle, eran quel dì a vederle, qual si posava in terra e qual sull'onde, qual con un vago errore girando parea dir qui regna amore. And then we go back to the memory of seeing her in this place, and and now you have the flower petals falling, and the petals falling here and there, e qual con un vago errore, in wandering vagary, but the literal Italian there is errore, which it means to make a mistake, but also to wander. And vago, Italian is the only language I'm aware of in which the word for vague has a positive connotation. In English, something that's vague is something that is not yet clear and needs to be made better defined. In Italian, vago is something that isn't tied down yet and is kind of free to wander in this wonderful, evasive manner. Vago, the donna that is vaga. Boccaccio has this poem that describes this girl talking about, she's vaga and she's so proud of her vaghezza that she has this vague wandering to her, and the quality of vagueness about her is something that she prides herself on. So this vago errore, it's this wandering about with that word for error in it, but in a very positive, like almost mystical fashion is the way that Petrarch's writing here. Quante volte dis'io allor pien di spavento, costei per fermo nacque in paradiso. Così carco d'oblio, il divin portamento, il volto e le parole, il dolce riso, m'aveano e sì diviso dall'immagine vera, che ei dicea sospirando, qui, come venio, o quando, credendo d'esser in ciel, non là dov'era. Da Indien qua mi piace quest'erba sì, ch'altrove non ho pace. And we have in these poems especially, the presentation of Laura that is similar to Dante's Beatrice, um, the angelic woman, the woman that isn't just like an angel because you love her and she's very beautiful, but is like an angel in the sense of a messenger between the poet and God. He's not quite going in the direction of Dante, where there's the certainty that that's what she is. But we went from beginning with her as the fera, the wild animal, to the one who is certainly born in paradise. Il divino portamento, her divine bearing. And all of these things that in Petrarch's memory were enough to confuse him from reality. The question of the divided self, where the senses, the sensation and belief are no longer matching up, that he's in an earthly place, but believing that he's in heaven. Se tu avessi ornamenti quant'hai voglia, potresti arditamente uscire dal bosco e gir fra la gente. If you had as much beauty as you wished, song, if you had as much beauty as you wish, you could boldly leave this wood and go among the people. So even the song itself here, usually in the concerto, these last few lines, The song is told to go out and either run to the lady that you're singing about or tell other people about this. Here, the song is stuck in the wood, the bosco, because it doesn't have quite as much beauty as the song itself wished. It's a weird personification of the song itself. Um, that the song isn't quite up to what it should be. It can't quite leave the wood yet and go amongst the people. So we end up with a reflection here. Petrarch's his status as a poet, the poetry that he creates, and the impression that that poetry makes on others. This song isn't quite up to the level to circulate amongst people uh, and gain Petrarch that fame. That even in a poem as beautiful and seemingly disconnected from fame as this one, I think that's where we always come back. And staying with the theme of Chiare fresche dolci acque, the previous canzone, uh, Petrarch continues on this notion of being away from his lover. And that is a very common theme in medieval poetry. The Provençal poets, writing in Occitan in the 12th and 13th century, one of the most famous of their songs describes what's called the amor de logna, that love from far away. The idea that in that original poem, the woman that he loves is so virtuous that even though the poet has never even seen her, just report of her virtue is enough for him to love her from the other end of the Mediterranean Sea. Um, and Petrarch, of course, is fully well aware of, the poetic pedigree of the themes that he's picking up here. But as always, he's doing something very different with it here. And this poem, 127, goes together with 129. And also like 126, they're poems about being distanced from Laura, but still having her again haunt his imagination. He's writing these while he's in Italy, and looking back towards his home outside of Avignon. In quella parte dove amor mi sprona, conven ch'io volga le dogliose rime, che son seguaci della mente afflitta. And so the sadness that appeared before, Petrarch compounds that here, the dogliose rime. Here he's stepping away from Dante, and he never follows Dante too closely. But Dante's friend Guido Cavalcanti, Petrarch's writing lyrics very similar to the kinds of poems that Guido Cavalcanti wrote, both in the sense of the tortured mind, these sorrowful verses, and above all, the divided self. Petrarch takes them much, much further. Qual fien ultime lasso, e qua fien prime, colui che del mio mal meco ragiona, mi lasci in dubbio, si confuso dita. Ma por quanto l'istoria trovo scritta in mezzo il cor, che si spesso rincorro, con le sue proprie mani nei martiri, dirò perché sospiri parlando an triegua, e al dolor soccorro. Dico che, perché io miri mille cose diverse, attento e fisso, sol una donna veggio, e il suo bel viso. And that most Petrarchan of things, fixation of the imagination, fixation in place, fixation when there should be movement. What Petrarch does so well in the Sestinas, where there's just this circular motion and not progression in any sense. He's bringing that into his poems here, where, as always, we come circling back to the same things again. Though I gaze at 1,000 diverse things attentively and fixedly, I only see one lady and one lovely face. Poi che la dispietata mia ventura m'ha dilungato dal maggior mio ben, noiosa, inexorabile, superba, amor col rimembrar sol mi mantenne. Onde s'io veggio in giovanil figura incominciarsi il mondo a vestir d'erba, farmi vedere in quella tate acerba la bella giovinetta, cuore e donna. And one of the other themes that pops up in these poems are that of the seasons, the etate. Etate in Italian, it's both season in the sense of the progression of the seasons, but it also means age, that kind of season. And Petrarch, in the poems that we'll look at tonight, leaves an ambiguity about the ages of the world, the ages of life. In the Middle Ages, life was divided up into 7 separate ages: infancy, childhood, adolescence. And adolescence would take you just to the cusp of manhood, and then you had youth, a separate period from adolescence when you were between about like 18 and 35 or so. You weren't considered to be fully mature. This was the period of your youthful adulthood. And then you had the other ages that followed that. You had the proper age of full maturity, then old age, and then at the very end, old age, senility, from the Latin senix, meaning just old. So when we have seasons and ages come up, what Petrarch's talking about now, I see in that bitter season, qualitate acerba. Acerba is not just bitter; it's also unripe. So it's said of fruits that haven't fully matured to sweetness yet. So in qualitate acerba, the early age of the world, the early age of an individual before they're matured. La bella giovinetta, and a giovinetta, the young girl that now is a woman, the donna. All of this coming again through the memory. Love aids me with my memory alone. And when I see in the earth the youthful guise begin to clothe itself with grass. So in the memory again, Petrarch is transported, and you have the world changing, going through its cycles, and you have Laura flowering into womanhood. Poiché sormonta riscaldando il sole, parmi qual esser sole, fiamma d'amor che in cuor alto s'endonna. Ma quando il dissidole di lui che passo passo dietro torni, veggio lei giunta ai suoi perfetti giorni. And so the sun rises, warming. It seems to me he is solely that flame of love that claims noble hearts. Um, and true love is something in the Middle Ages that could only be experienced by the noble heart. On the one hand, meaning the aristocracy, but in the poetic sense, meaning those people, the poets who have been ennobled by love and are able to separate themselves from that vulgar crowd, because that vulgar crowd is always lurking in the back of Petrarch that he's trying to keep away from. And after the day, the sun comes up and rises in the day, then we have the day grieving for him. We have um, the dusk that sets. And that, of course, also is the image of the ages of life itself, that man has the morning, the sunrise that is infancy, and by noon he's at full maturity. And then as the sun goes down, dusk sets, you slide into old age and then eventually death. But as the day grieves his descends little by little, I see her in days of maturity. So Petrarch's memory of her isn't fitting up with the metaphor that he set of the setting sun. and the days going by. In ramo fronde, over viole in terra, mirando alla stagione che il freddo perde, e le stelle miglior acquistan forza. Negli occhi ho pur le violette e il verde, di che era nel principio di mia guerra, amor armato, sì che ancor mi sforza, e quella dolce e la gedretta scorza, che ricopria le pargolette membra, dove oggi alberga l'anima gentile, c'ogni altro piacer vile, sembrar mi fa. Sì forte mi rimembra del portamento umile che lor fioriva, poi crebbe anzi agli anni, cagion sola e riposo dei miei affanni. Qualor tenere neve pellicoli dal sol percorso veggio di lontano, come il sol neve mi governa umore, pensando nel bel viso più che umano, che può da lunge gli occhi miei far molli, ma da presso gli abbaglia e vince il cuore, ove fra il bianco e l'aureo colore sempre mi mostra quel che mai non vide occhio mortal, che io creda altro che il mio, e del caldo desio che quando sospirando ella sorride m'infiamma sì che oblio niente apprezza, ma diventa eterno, né state il cangia né lo spegne il verno. And those last few lines there, that inflames me so that it makes me forget nothing, but becomes eternal, nor changes state, nor quenches spring. Um, but for all of the image that we have here of the natural world as it changes through seasons, the power of Laura's mortal face, the more than mortal face, nel bel viso più che umano. Don't like that translation of mortal just because mortale in Italian has it brings with it mortal is due to death, or that is something that is due to die. But this and that for somebody who loves Augustine, mortale is a very loaded word. That's not what he uses in the Italian. It's a face that's just more than human, più che umano. With all of this change we have towards the end here, that which is now becoming eternal, nor changes state, nor quenches spring. That fixity in the midst of all the change. Non vidi mai, dopo natura pioggia, gir per l'aere sereno stelle erranti, e fiammeggiar fra la reggiura e il gelo. Chi non avesse i begli occhi davanti, ove la stanca mia vita s'appoggia, quale io li vidi all'ombra di un bel velo. E sì, come di lor bellezze il cielo splendea quel dì, così bagnati ancora, li veggio sfavillare, onde io sempre ardo. Se il sol levarsi sguardo, sento il lume apparir, cammina amore. Se tramontarsi al tardo, farmel veder quando si volge altrove, lasciando tenebroso onde si muove. Se mai candide rose con vermiglie in vasel loro vide gli occhi miei, allora lor da vergine man colte, veder pensaro il viso di colei, avanza tutte l'altre maraviglie, con tre belle eccellenzie in lui raccolte, le bionde trecce sopra il collo sciolte, ov'ogni latte perderia sua prova, e le guance che adorno un dolce focco, ma pur che loro un poco fior bianchi e gialli per le piagge mova, torna alla mente il loco. Il primo di chi vidi a Laura sparsi. And again, the blow by the wind here, vid a Laura sparsi. Laura is that wind that again in the Italian is written as lauda. Vidi Laura sparsi I capei d'oro, onde io sì subito arsi. Ad una annoverar le stelle, in picciol vetro chiuder tutte l'acque, forse credea, quando in sì poca carte novo pensier di ricontarmi nacque, in quante parti il fior dell'altre belle, stando in se stessa, alla sua luce sparta ciò, che mai da lei non mi diparta, né farò io. E se pur talor fugo, in cielo in terra mare chiuso i passi, perché agli occhi miei lassi sempre presente, onde io tutto mi strugo, e così meco stassi, ch'altre non veggio mai, né veder brammo, nel nome d'altre, né sospir miei chiammo. And if I flee at times, she has closed the passes in heaven and earth, so that to my weary eyes she is always present, and I am all consumed. And she stays with me, so that I see nothing else, nor wish to see, nor speak another's name in my sighing. If we think about the sighing that Petrarch imagined when Laura came and saw his grave, and sighed sincerely and mercifully to God for his soul, um, the kind of sighing that he's doing here is completely different. Ben sai, canzon, che quant'io parlo è nulla al celato amoroso mio pensiero, che dì e notte nella mente porto, solo per cui conforto, in così lunga guerra anco non perdo, che ben m'avria già morto la lontananza del mio cuor piangendo, ma quinci dalla morte indugio prendo. La lontananza del mio cuor piangendo, crying for, the absence, um, yes, absence, but also lontananza. It's absence, but it implies also great distance. But by this I gain my death's delay. So just these fantastic images that Petrarch's pulling together of time, memory, progression, the future and the past, and the present. The present of this, of course, Petrarch is absent to. That is where he's writing this and what he's doing, does not appear in this poetry at all. He's totally consumed in memory and imagination of what has been and what could be, um, but not at all where he actually is. These poems are then divided up by 128, which is Italia Mia, and this is Petrarch's his invective against Italy. And so we go from, the hyper-personal world of not just Petrarch's love, but Petrarch talking about his memory of love. And we break up 127 and 129, which is very similar to 127, with this canzone in which Petrarch, while in Italy, in Milan, is writing just a screed against all of the petty lords in Italy, who, through their actions and inactions, have basically guaranteed that Italy remains just a concept. Italy does not come to be a country until 1870. It only exists as a concept, basically from the fall of the Roman Empire, until the Risorgimento and the unification of Italy, in the late 19th century. And above all, it's a concept that we read about in the poets, that they recognize that everybody on the peninsula shares a common heritage, a common culture. They speak different languages because Italy is so incredibly divided that literally every major city in Italy has its own specific dialect in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But all of those dialects are much more closely related to each other than they are to French or Spanish. And as the French are coalescing into a nation state, because that's what's going on in Dante and Petrarch's lifetime, the English, they've already formed a state since 1066. They're, culturally united in a way nobody else is, even if they're a people of two languages for a while. In Petrarch's life, France is starting to form, and you can start to see that in Spain as well. They're still competing kingdoms, but they're starting to coalesce. Exactly, they have kingdoms in Spain, Castile and Aragon. Italy is just the abode of all of these petty lords. The kingdom that you have in Italy, the kingdom of the two Sicilies, um, is ruled by a French family. Um, and so it's specifically through language that the idea of Italy has all of its reality up until the founding of that state. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but this is Petrarch's greed against the rulers of Italy, um, who through selfishness, greed, and sloth have guaranteed that Italy is basically almost a playground for the other great states, which is what it'll completely turn into in the late 15th century. Um, there's French and Spanish armies moving through Italy already in Petrarch's lifetime. By the time you get into the full Renaissance, those armies will just completely divide up the entire country. 129, which is a beautiful poem, but taking a look at where we're at time-wise, it's a long canzone, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. We'll stop here for a bit of a pause so that I'll just stop talking for a little bit. If there's any questions, please put those up either in chat or the Q&A. Okay, and Pam, it looks I'm looking at the email, Pam, that you sent to me, that you had a hard time getting into the classroom, but it looks like you're here now. Um, can I ask what happened with the link that you had?
I think what happened was I was trying to log into or zoom into your other class.
Oh,
It was
okay.
it was
Okay.
nothing with this.
Okay. Right before class, I had updated one of the settings on this class. Um,
Ah,
so when I saw your email, I was afraid that while updating it, I sent out like a new link. Because I've definitely done that before.
yeah,
Okay.
I tried all the links in it, and then I realized I was for your Catholic imagination class for
Okay.
Monday night. So disregard my emails.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad that it worked out,
Thank you.
and I'm glad that I didn't unintentionally misdirect part of my class.
No, no, I was panicking there for a while because I thought that I was not being let in. So,
Oh no, well, I mean, I appreciate the all caps email because that shows to me that the class is important. So
well, and I thought you'd see it.
yeah, I mean, I did eventually, when I looked down from poetry back into the real world for just a second, it just took 40 minutes for that to happen.
That's all right. I caught most of it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Um, having cleared up that confusion, after the long canzone, we'll keep things short and look at a few sonnets for a bit here. Canzoni are wonderful, but it's occasionally nice to have shorter poems that don't require quite as much mental effort just to get through. So 131 32, 33, and 34. It's just a collection of these beautiful sonnets that are all put together. And in this, we see the thematizing of, Petrarch, being very proud of himself as a poet. The opening line to this, I would sing of love in so new a way. Um, I mean, we can most definitely say 130 poems into the Rime Sparse, there really isn't, there are no new ways left of singing of love. And I think we could say that for all of Western history, that by the time that we get here, pretty much every love song or every love poem that has been written since, in some way is a derivative or borrows the same concepts that Petrarch used up to this point. But Petrarch's going to tell us that, he's still going to sing of love in a very new way. And what we begin to see are the fractures in the psyche that appear and just become the content of his poems, the fractured, the divided self. Io canterei d'amor sì novamente, ch'al duro fianco il di mille sospiri trarrei per forza, e mille alti desiri raccenderei nella gelata mente. Il bel viso vedrei cangiar sovente, e bagnar gli occhi, e più pietosi giri far, come suol chi degli altrui martiri, e del suo error, quando non val, si pente. E le rose vermiglie in fra le neve muover d'allora e di scoprir l'avorio che fa di marmo chi da presso il guarda. E tutto quel perché nel viver breve non rincresco a me stesso, anzi mi glorio d'esser servato alla stagion più tarde. So in the first quatrain there, sing of love in a new way, I draw 1,000 sighs and light 1,000 noble desires in that hard heart and that chill mind. So when we looked at Dante's Rime Petrose last week, the woman that has the heart of stone, um, that threatens to turn the lover into stone as well. And everything's iced over, including the stony, icy hearts. Here we have that not just that chill mind in English can completely miss the point here if we take that as relaxed. The gelata mente is the mind that is frozen over. And this is all what Petrarch could do here in his imagination to change the status of his love. This is Laura, who's now, the stony woman here, that hard heart. He's going to melt her frozen over mind and make her sympathetic towards him. I'd see her change her expression, and bagnar gli occhi, and turn more pityingly, like one who, when it's no use, repents of another's suffering and her own error. And those two lines are just fantastic. That he's, through these words, through these poems, he's going to soften her disdain for him. And he's going to make her act come suol chi degli altrui martiri el del suo error quando non val si pente. As would one who repents of their own mistake, their own error, and the sufferings of another quando non val, when it's now no use, when it no longer serves any purpose. And here we see that word error used to describe Laura. Del suo error is that Petrarch's song is going to be so moving that Laura recognizes her own error. um, and repents when it's no use. And then, the Le Rose Vermiglie in Fra le Neve, and just the image there of scarlet roses in the white snow. Move at her breath, revealing ivory, discovrir lavorio, che fa di marmo chi da presso il guarda. That turns the one who looks at this into marble. And all of that, however, non rincresco a me stesso. I'm not upset about all of this in this short life, nel viver breve. Mi glaudio. This is what I can glory in. D'esser servato alla stagione più tarda. That all of this occurred only late in life. Having been born is kind of a weird translation of that. That all of this occurs alla stagione più tarda, and in this late age, he's referring, this is where the ages mean, the seasons of life, that this didn't happen when he was younger, that this is happening now, as Petrarch's in his late 30s, 40s. S'amor non è, e dunque è quel che io sento, ma se egli è amor, per Dio, che cosa è quale? Se buono, onde l'affetto aspro mortale, se ria, onde si dolce ogni tormento. Sa mia voglia ardo, onde il pianto e lamento. Sa mal mio grado, il lamentar che vale. O viva morte, o dilettoso male. Come puoi tanto in me se il non consento? E se io il consento a gran torto mi doglio. Fra si contrari venti in fra barca mi trovo in alto mar senza governo, si lieve di sever, d'arror si carca. Chi medesimo non so quel ch'io mi voglio, e tremo a mezz'estate ardendo il verno. And so here we have all of the contradictions leading to this divided, confused self. If this isn't love, then what on earth is it that I'm feeling? Ma se egli è amor, per Dio che cosa è quale. But if this is love, by God, what is this thing? If it's good, why is the effect? And here's where mortal's being used properly. L'effetto aspro mortale, the bitter mortal in the death sense of the effect of this. If love is good, why this death drive from it? But if it's bad, why are the sufferings so sweet? And here we get into the question that will come up brilliantly in the final poem that we look at next week. Sa mia voglia ardo onde il pianto elemento. Voglia here is desire, but it's also will. If it is my will that I burn, then why am I crying and grieving about it? Sa mal mio grado e lamentar che vale. And if this is all opposed to me, what's the use if this is for my harm? What's the use of crying about it? And then viva morte, dilettoso male. The contradictions, living death, delightful evil. Come puoi tanto in me se io non consento? How is all of this happening if I am not agreeing to it? that question of the will, of free will. The suffering that we have here that's coming from our irrational, and by irrational, I don't mean bad. I mean emotional, non-intellectual, that part of ourselves. The love that stems up from all of that. How is this having such an effect on Petrarch if he doesn't consent to it? This isn't just a random thought that's racing through his head. This is something that, he's been turning over, obsessing over for years, decades at this point. How can this happen if I don't consent, if this isn't what I'm choosing to do? And if I do consent, sorry, and if I do consent, a gran torto mi dolio, that I am in the wrong for complaining about this if this is what I am choosing. So that contradiction of, I'm claiming that all of this is happening to me, but he's clearly enjoying it and on some level willing it. But if he does will this, why all of the complaints? And then that image of the boat at sea again. Fra si contrari venti in fra le barca, mi trovo in alto mar senza governo. The metaphor that's so much more common in love poetry, that he's a ship being tossed by a storm at sea, that he has no control over this. Senza governo. Without a helm, and governo in Italian literally is the helm, but that's also governance. Without the ability to control myself, senza governo. Si lieve di saver, not just knowledge, but wisdom as well. Si lieve di saver d'error si carca. And carca, here he's describing the boat again with these words, that the boat itself it's almost as though it's a merchant vessel that is just overflowing with error that he's bringing back home. Che io medesimo non so quel che mi voglio. That after all of this discussion of his will and what he is choosing to do, and whether all of this is just happening to him, that finally I don't even know what it is that I want for myself. E tremo in mezz'estate ardendo il verno, that I'm shivering at the height of summer, burning in the winter. And this last line here, that's going in a different direction than previous. Previous everything here, we have the contradictions and whatnot. But the contradictory state of him in the situation that he's in, that will continue into 134 after this. Amor m'ha posto come segno astrale, come al sol neve, come cera il fuoco, come nebbia al vento, e son già rocco, donna, mercé chiamendo, e voi non cale. Dagli occhi vostri usciu il colpo mortale, contra cui non mi val tempo né loco. Da voi sola procede, e parvi un gioco. Il solo, il fuoco, il vento, ond'io son tale. I pensier son saite, il viso un sole, il desir fuoco insiem con quest'arme, mi punge amor, m'abbaglia e mi distrugge. E l'angelico canto e le parole, col dolce spirito ond'io non posso aitarmi, son laure innanzi a cui mia vita fugge. And again, that breeze, Laura, is her literal name there. And so this, it calls back to some of the early poems that we looked at in the first lesson. Love as the archer, making Petrarch the target. And a target that is absolutely powerless, like snow in the sunlight, like wax thrown into the fire, a cloud pushed about by the wind. E son già rocco, donna, mercé chiamando. e voi non cale. And you indifferent, you utterly unconcerned. And again, the colpo mortale, the mortal blow, the killing blow that came from your eyes. So all the way back in the second and third poems, where Petrarch introduces his love of Laura and talks about that day that love attacked him. We're going back to that image where Laura, in the canzone that we were looking at, that image had softened so much as she's no longer present, and he's trying to just remember things and imagine better futures. Here we come back to the militant imagery of love and that killing glance that issues from her eyes, against which no time or place helps me. So that distance, the lontananza that he was talking about in 127 here, that's utterly destroyed. The lontananza doesn't matter at all. That this is just a cruel game that's being played that turns Petrarch into what he is. And everything about Laura now is a weapon. Your thoughts are arrows. Your face, the sun that burns. The desire is fire. And with all of these weapons, love pierces him, dazzles, and dazzle here, yeah, dazzle and melts. The Italian, mi abbaglia e mi distrugge. Abbagliare is to make something blind through literally brilliant light. So it dazzles to the sense where he loses his ability to see. E mi distrugge. Literally just destroys me. E l'angelico canta le parole col dolce spirito, onde io non posso attarmi. The angelic singing, the sweet spirit. We go back to the words describing Laura as this being from heaven. But here, that presentation is completely at odds, that it's almost ironic that, yeah, she does have angelic singing and speech, but these are weapons as well. They're things from which I have no defense. And this is the wind before which his life flies. And 134, which is just the most magnificent poem that is set up of opposition. Pace non trovo, e non ho da far guerra, e temo e spero, e ardo e sono un ghiaccio, e volo sopra il cielo e giaccio in terra, e nulo stringo e tutto il mondo abbraccio. Tal man pregion che non m'apre ne serra, né per suo mi riten, né scioglie il laccio, e non m'ancide amore, e non mi sterra, né mi vuol vivo, né mi trae d'impaccio. Veggio senza occhi, non ho lingua e grido, e bramo di perir, e cheggio aita, e odio me stesso e amo altrui. Pascomi di dolor, piangendo rido, e ugualmente mi spiace morte e vita. In questo stato son donna per voi. So, I mean, what Petrarch's able to do here just poetically is magnificent. Putting together all of these opposites in just single lines, one after the other, according to the rhyme scheme. And the progression that goes on. In the first, it's just Petrarch. He's not saying, what is causing this condition, what's to blame for this condition, what's at fault here. It's just all of the contradictory states that he's in. I can find no peace, but I'm not making. I fear and hope and burn and I'm ice. And then we enter not with a description of someone, how, just somebody ma in prigione, has me in prison, in her own prison. Che non m'apri né serve. He's in prison, but the door is not open for him, but it's also not barred. He's not kept as someone else's, but he's not freed from the laccio, the noose, or just the knot that's holding him. And love doesn't destroy me, but also doesn't let me go. Ne mi vol vivo, ne mi trae d'impaccio. Doesn't want me alive, but literally it's not also removing the noose. And so because of that, we have another set of just fantastic oppositions here. E o in odio me stesso. I have myself in hatred. E amo altrui. And after all of this, in questo stato son donna per voi. There are many beautiful soft love poems to Lauda here, but this one, it's hard to read that as anything but a bitter accusation that I am this way because of you, or I'm in this state. And I think on that one, oh wow, there we go. We'll take another pause before we move on. Since those sonnets just formed a nice unity on their own. Before we move on, we'll take another pause. Oh, and I think last week with the recording, I included a PDF that had all of the slides that I was using, just so that you could see the Petrose. But if it was helpful to have the slides with the translations and the Italian, if anybody benefited from that, please let me know and I'll continue to send those along. And if you do not need 120 slides, let me know and I won't bother you with those. Okay, and a canzone that in some part kind of wraps up what was going on in the previous sonnets. All of these, the contradictions, the divided self, the uncertainty, um, the state of uncertainty, and then the alternating states of certainties that I love this and that I need to get away from this as soon as possible. All of that end up being put together in this canzone where Petrarch is pulling images. marvelous stories of marvelous beings that he puts in here and there the sort of response to his contradictory state. So in a sense, what had been done on a small level in the sonnets here, he's bringing together in a grand canzone, you know, with all of the classical learning that he just loves to show off whenever he has the opportunity. Dante was basically the same way. I'm not criticizing Petrarch too much when I say that. I mean, realistically, everybody who has great classical learning loves showing it off whenever they have. Just one of the effects of learning about the classical. Qual più diversa e nova cosa fu mai in qualche strano clima, quella, se ben estima, più mi risembra, a tal son giunto amore. La onde il dì ven fore, vola un augel che sol senza consorte, di volontaria morte rinasce, e tutto a viver si rinnova, così sol si ritrova lo voler mio, e così in sulla cima dei suoi alti pensieri al sol si volve, e così si risolve, e così torna al suo stato di prima, arde e muore e riprende i nervi suoi, e poi e vive poi con la fenice a prova. So first he summons up the phoenix. And the myth, the legend of the phoenix is that it was a bird that lived, far off in India, where the day is born in the direction of sunrise, and that there could only ever be one phoenix at a time, and that it would live for 500 years. And when the phoenix found itself at the end of this life cycle, the phoenix would take off and fly directly towards the sun. Flying towards the sun, it would then eventually just be consumed by heat. And the phoenix would die and fall back to earth just in ashes. But then out of the ashes, the phoenix would be reborn. So you take this story in mythology and put it into a Christian setting. And you have the voluntary sacrifice, the giving up of life only to be reborn. And it's important to keep in mind how, that image was almost always read in a sense of salvation and the resurrection. So is my desire found alone, and so it turns to the heights of noble thought towards the sun, and so it is destroyed, and so it returns to its first state. It burns, and dies, and regains its strength. So Petrarch's desire for Laura here, but also could be his desire for glory. It turns to the heights of noble thought towards the sun. So either the noble thought of the ennobling love in the poetic tradition, or the noble thought of, the intellectual, the theologians turning either to pure philosophy or to contemplation of God, turning to the highest things, and is just destroyed and then returns to its first state. Is a metaphor that it's not smooth. It doesn't immediately work. Una petra si ardita, là per l'indico mar, che di natura tragge a sé il ferro, il fura da legno, in guisa che navigi affonde. Questo provio fra l'onde d'amaro pianto, che quel bello scoglio ha col suo duro argoglio condotto ove affondar conven mia vita. Così l'alma è sfornita, forando il cur, che fu già cosa dura, e me tenne un cor son diviso e sparso. Un sasso a trar più scarso carne che ferro. O cruda mia ventura che in carne essendo, veggio trarmi a riva ad una viva dolce calamita. So the calamita is the magnet. And the magnet was known in classical times, but it's in the Middle Ages, it's in Petrarch's time, that the magnet is finally put to to good use the magnetic compass that appears, I think, in the 1200s in the Mediterranean Sea, and then very quickly spreads all over Europe. That for all of that imagery that we've had of the vessels, the ships, Petrarch's comparing himself here to this marvelous rock that has the ability to help ships steer themselves through the storms, through the darkness of night, to find that proper port. What's used to save ships, however, for Petrarch, he's comparing it to himself being among the waves, this lovely reef with its harsh pride that causes shipwreck. So my soul is stripped, and stealing my heart that was once whole and making me now scattered and divided. Diviso e sparso. And sparso, they're divided. That's the word that Petrarch uses in that first poem to describe the entire collection, the rime sparse. Spargere is to divide, but also to scatter. So diviso e sparso, cut into and tossed about. A stone to draw flesh more than iron. Out of the ancient stories of the magnets, there was also the myth of a particular rock that could attract not iron, but could draw flesh with it. And so Petrarch picks that up here, and you have the cruel fate that he's being dragged by this calamita, and that word that's important here, that this is actually as a magnet, does not appear in the translation. Towards a sweet living danger, ad una viva dolce calamita. That it's a danger is implied, but it's this living magnet that she has, and how often magnetic attraction is used to describe incipient loves. Here, that magnetic attraction is not being used in a positive sense at all. Nell'estremo occidente una fera. And the fera, that is again the wild animal, è suave e quieta tanto che nulla più, ma pianto e doglia e morte dentro agli occhi porta. Molto convene accorta esser questa qual vista, mai ver lei si giri, purché gli occhi non miri, l'altro puossi veder sicuramente. Ma io incauto, dolente, corro sempre al mio male, e so ben quanto n'ho sofferto e n'aspetto, ma l'ingordo voler che cieco e sordo sì mi trasporta, che il bel viso santo e gli occhi vaghi fien cagion che io pera di questa fera angelica innocente. Surge nel mezzogiorno una fontana e tien nome del sole, che per natura sole bollir le notti, in sul giorno esser fredda, e tanto si rifredda. Quanto il sol monte, quanto e più da presso, così avvena me stesso che son fonte di lagrime e soggiorno. Quanto il bel lume adorno che il mio sol s'allontana, e triste e sole son le mie luce, e notte oscura è loro. Ardo allor, ma se loro e rai veggio apparir dal vivo sole, tutto dentro e di fuor sento cangiarmi, e ghiaccio farmi, così freddo torno. Un'altra fonte è Apiro, di cui si scrive che essendo freddo ella, ogni spenta faccella accende, e spegni qual trovasse accesa. L'anima mia ch'offesa ancor non era d'amoroso foco, appressandosi un poco a quella fredda che io sempre sospiro, arse tutta, e martiro simil giammai non, né sol vide né stella, con cuor di marmo a pietà mosso avrebbe, poi che infiammata l'ebbe ripensa la virtù gelata e bella, così più volte al cuore acceso e spenta, il so che il sento, e spesso me ne nardiro. For tutti i nostri lidi, nelle isole famose di fortuna, due fonti ha, chi da l'una be mor ridendo, e chi dall'altra scampa. Simil fortuna stampa mia vita, che morir poria ridendo, del gran piacer ch'io prendo, se nol temprassen dolorosi stride. Amor ch'ancor mi guide pura l'ombra di fama occulta e bruna, tacerem questa fonte, agnor piena, ma con più larga vena vegem, quando col toro il sol s'aduna, così gli occhi miei piangon d'ogni tempo, ma più nel tempo che Madonna vidi. Chi spiasse, canzone, quel ch'io fo, tu puoi dir, sotto un gran sasso in un chiusa vale, ond'esce surga, si sta, né chi lo scorga ve, se non amor, che mai non lascia un passo, e l'immagine d'un che lo strugge, che per sé fugge tutt'altre persone. And so we return Petrarch to his home in Valcusa. Cusa Valley. Valcuse literally means the closed valley. The Sorgue River, which is a tributary of the Rhone, goes through the Valcusa. And here we have, and this is an image that becomes more important, Petrarch in solitude. He's all there by himself, except for Love, who never leaves his side. E l'immagine d'una che lo strugge, and that image that stays with him in his solitude of the one who destroys him, for whom he flees all others, che per sé fugge tutt'altre persone. And the solitude that Petrarch has that's interrupted by love and the image of Laura. Petrarch, one of the religious projects that he had for himself was imagining the a religious solitude that would not be only for monks or those under a religious rule, but the beneficial solitude for both a religious and intellectual life that could be shared by everyone. The idea of fleeing from society, having that life alone with thoughts, the life that would be both the intellectual life, but the Christian intellectual life, a Christian humanism, a life spent alone in a sort of intellectual asceticism is the idea that Petrarch had. And he wrote works on this, on religious solitude and on the individual solitude. But here, that fantastic goal that he has of being away from society, to be one with books and thoughts and ultimately God and contemplation. It's interrupted by the image, d'una che lo strugge, that image of Laura that comes in and destroys him. These three poems, 136, 137, and 138. Petrarch has just ended the previous poem by himself in Valcusa, where he's writing, he's studying, he's praying alone, but he's still tormented by love and thoughts of Laura. These three poems bring him back into that world that he fled. Fuggire, to flee, to altre persone. And the world that he's fleeing from, he's going to describe here. These three are describing the corruption of the papal court in Avignon. And Avignon is literally just down the Sorgue River from Valcusa. So Petrarch is nearby. And Petrarch had moved to Avignon in his youth with his father. His father was able to get work in Avignon. He was a notary. So the papal court in Avignon had great need of notaries. They produce a ton of legal documents, and they needed people just to keep up with the incredible paperwork. The papal court in Avignon was every bit as bureaucratic and capable of producing huge amounts of paperwork as any bureaucracy that's ever existed. Um, Unfortunately, part of the bureaucracy that they created also involved quite a bit of corruption. Um, just all of the cases that went to Avignon for final judgment. You think about a world in which religious orders have so much land, and that land is butting up against other land owned by lords, owned by bishops. And so the question of who actually owns this village, who owns these farms, who owns this trading post, who do all of these serfs fall under? The nonstop questions that occur when you have the church being by far the largest landowner in the Middle Ages, but then also having not clear lines of demarcation, because so much of it is also owned by religious orders that do not report to the bishop, but report directly to Rome. So just all of the cases that end up in Avignon, that have to go through all the various courts in Avignon, that require all of the canon lawyers that are in Avignon, none of whom are free. And of course, if you end up in Avignon needing a case to be heard, there are always people who know people who, for a bribe, will see to it that your case gets heard faster. And there's also people who know people who are willing to make sure that certain cases will slow down if by slowing down you can drain your opponent of money as they're trying to live in Avignon, and then eventually they have to just go home. And that's to say nothing of the cases of rich families making huge donations so that their sons and nephews can become abbots, bishops, and cardinals. So the next three poems, that's the world that Petrarch is describing. The phrase of the Avignon papacy being the church's Babylonian captivity. That's one of Petrarch's favorite descriptions of Avignon, is Babylonia. Fiamme del ciel sulle tue trecce piova malvagia, e dal fiume della ghianda per l'altrui impoverir sei ricca e grande, poiché di mal oprar tanto ti giova, nido di tradimenti in cui si cova quanto mal per lo mondo oggi si spande, di vin serva di letti e di vivande, in cui lussuria fa l'ultima prova. Per le camere tue fanciulle vecchi vanno trescando, e Belzebubi in mezzo coi manticci e col fuoco e con gli specchi. Già non fustu nudrita in piume al rezzo, ma nuda al vento e scalza fra gli stecchi. Or vivi sì ch'addio ne venga il lezzo. La vara Babilonia a colmo il sacco d'ira di Dio, e di vizi empi e rei, tanto che scoppia, e ha fatti suoi dei, non Giove e Pala, ma Venere e Bacco. Aspettando ragion mi strugo e fiacco, ma pur novo soldan veggio per lei, la qual farà non già quando io vorrei, sol una sede, e quella fia in baldacco. Gli idoli suoi saranno in terra sparsi, e le torre superbe al ciel nemiche, e i suoi torrer di fuor com dentro arsi. Anime belle di virtute amiche verranno il mondo, e poi vedrem lui farsi aurea tutto e pien d'all'opere antiche. Fontana di dolore, albergo d'ira, scolla d'errore e templo d'eresia, già Roma or Babilonia falsa e ria, per cui tanto si piange e si sospira. o fucina d'inganni, o pregion d'ira, ove il ben muore, il mal si nutre e cria. Di vivi inferno un gran miracol fia, se Cristo teco al fin non s'adiria. Fondate in caste umil povertate, contra tuoi fondatori alzi le corna, puta sfacciata, dove hai posto spene? Negli adulteri tuoi, nelle malnate ricchezze tante? Or Constantin non torna, ma tolga il mondo tristo che il sostenne. And the reference to Constantine there, in the Middle Ages, it was believed that the Emperor Constantine, when he legalized Christianity in 313, after winning the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, before which he saw in the sky the Cairo, and the words "in hoc signo vinces," in this sign you will conquer. And so after winning a battle in a civil war at the Milvian Bridge on the northern bend of the Tiber in Rome, Constantine legalized Christianity, and not just legalized it, but favored it. Made donations of land to the church, and it's under Constantine that the great basilicas of Rome were first built. St. Paul outside the walls, St. Peter's, the original St. Peter's in the Vatican, St. John Lateran, and St. Mary Major were all originally Constantinian donations and constructions. But the belief in the Middle Ages was that when Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, that he gave power over the Western Roman Empire to the popes. And there was a forged document from the 9th century, the donation of Constantine, that supposedly recorded all of this. It was recognized in the late 1400s that this document was a 9th century forgery. A Renaissance scholar basically used historical philology for the first time to prove that this could not possibly have been written in Constantine's age. But the idea, and Dante had this idea as well, and you see it in Inferno. Ai Constantine di quanto male fu madre, non tua conversione, ma quella dote che da te prise primo ricco patre. Ai Constantine, how much evil was not your conversion, but that gift that you gave the first rich pope, the mother of. The gift was the mother of all of these evils, that by giving the church secular wealth, Constantine inadvertently introduced corruption to the church. And there actually is a fair amount of that. When Christianity became legal, not just legal, but favored in the Roman Empire, that's when ambitious Romans recognized that by joining the church, they could advance their own careers. St. Augustine, when he's writing Confessions, a significant portion of that is almost an apology, in the traditional sense of a defense, an apologia of his conversion, because his biography up to that point was exactly the biography of somebody who used the church for personal advancement. That if you weren't to know Augustine at all, you would see somebody who had been trained in rhetoric, became a professor of rhetoric, got to go to the Great Imperial School of Rhetoric, taught at the Imperial School of Rhetoric in Milan, converted to Christianity, and then became a bishop, and therefore became significantly powerful and wealthy. Without the knowledge of Augustine's tormented conversion over the span of 30 years, Augustine's conversion would absolutely look like somebody who had taken advantage of an opportunity presented by Constantine. Anyway, that's the reference to Constantine in that, and everything that Avignon and the papal court has become. Um, Petrarch would never admit to agreeing with Dante. That question about Petrarch is always, how are you an Italian poet after Dante? Petrarch pretended for his entire life that he never read Dante. He claimed that the Divine Comedy was popular amongst, the uneducated, but he himself had only ever seen very little bits of it. But he shares Dante's opinion of the corruption of the church, and like Dante, he's looking for the day when the church will be purified. And Petrarch died 7 years too early. He dies in 1374. So there's discussions about bringing the papacy back to Rome. But it doesn't actually occur until 1381 with the urgings of Catherine of Siena. But it was something that he was looking for his entire life, for the church to come back to its home, to end the Babylonian captivity. Of the remaining poems that we're going to look at, and we're going to go through the last 70 that are on my list here very quickly, and only a few. The Sestine. The Sestina poem, again, it's one that I think the only one that I'm familiar with that's been written in English was Ezra Pound, and I guess there's no point in getting around it now. My personal tastes are, I don't want to read poetry from a literal fascist, so we'll just ignore Ezra Pound's poem there. The Sestina, it's this medieval poem that there were very few of them written even in the Middle Ages. The Provençal poet Arnaud Daniel wrote one. Dante wrote one real sestina, and then what he called a double sestina. Petrarch writes 9 of them in the Rime Sparse, and they serve his purpose so well that rather than having the rhymes, they have the rhyme words, and the rhyme words change position. So you have this most Petrarchan of things. You're talking about moving forward, but you stay in stasis, a beautiful moving stasis, but there's no actual progression. Alla dolce ombra delle belle fronde corsi fuggendo un dispietato lume, che infin qua giù mardea del terzo cielo. And the third heaven there is that of Venus. So astrologically, it's the heaven that inspires one to love. E discombrava già di neve i poggi, Laura amorosa, and the loving breeze, Laura amorosa, from loving Laura is also literally what it means. Che rinnova il tempo, e fioren per le piagge l'erba e i rami. Non vide il mondo sì leggiadri rami, né mosse il vento mai sì verdi frondi, come a me si mostrar quel primo tempo, tal che temendo dall'ardente lume, non volsi al mio rifugio ombra di poggi, ma dalla pianta più gradita in cielo. Un lauro mi difese allor dal cielo, onde più volte vago dei bei rami, ed a son gitto per selve e per poggi, né già mai ritrovai tronco né frondi tanto onorate dal supremo lume, che non mutasser qualitate a tempo. Però più fermo ognor di tempo in tempo, seguendo ove chiamar mi udie dal cielo, scorto d'un suave chiaro lume, tornai sempre devoto ai primi rami, e quanto a terra son sparte le frondi, e quando il sol fa verdeggiar poggi. Selve, sassi, compane, fiume, poggi, quanto è creato vince e cangia il tempo. Ond'io cheggio perdono a queste frondi, se rivolgendo poi molt'anni il cielo, fuggir disposi l'invescati rami, tosto che incominciai di veder lume. Tanto mi piacque prima il dolce lume, che passai con diletto assai gran poggi per poter appressar gli amati rami. Ora la vita breve e loco il tempo mostranmi altro sentier di gire al cielo e di far frutto non pur fior e frondi. Altro amor, altre frondi e altro lume, altro salir al ciel per altri poggi, cerco che ne ben tempo e altri rami. So this poem, it's thought, could have been composed in 1350, which was a year of a jubilee. Um, the Jubilee year was something that had been brought back in the year 1300 by Boniface VIII. The Pope in 1350, I want to say Clement VI, but I'm not positive on that one. Um, in 1350, he called for another Jubilee year. Um, so the hills and the Frondi, the hills, if we're speaking of a Jubilee and we're speaking of Rome, the famous hills of Rome, and the Frondi and the Rami, the leaves and branches that always bring us back to the laurel tree that is the symbol of um, poetic triumph and poetic immortality. Uh, and that poetic immortality that he tells us that I was so pleased at first by the light that I passed with delight among the vast hills, so I might be near the beloved branches. This time in his past, um, where he's probably referencing his coronation as poet laureate. Um, as time moves and we have these images of ancient Rome, the laurel, which is an evergreen tree, so it doesn't change. And we come to this moment now. Now the brief life, the place, and the season show me another path to climb to heaven and bear fruit, not only flowers and leaves. So again, this urgency that's coming up of towards the end of the life, making that complete conversion, um, attaining not just poetic immortality, but attaining real everlasting life, using what he has with his time left on earth, not just to bear flowers and leaves, not just that laurel crown, that symbol of fame, and that symbol of fame that for Petrarch is also a sign of his shortcomings, being seduced by fame, but di far frutto, to bear actual fruit, to do the work of God and not just of his ego. And so, altro amor, altre frondi, altro lume, another love, other leaves, another light, altro salir al ciel, another stairway to heaven, from other hills, altri poggi cerco, che ne ben tempo, e altri rami. I'm looking for all of these things because this is the time. There is time left for this and other branches. So the poem that can so easily be turned into one of stasis and unchangeableness, here we have that yearning for actual progress, and finding the progress altro, in another, rather than the paths that he's always tread to this point. Um, 150, the divided self that we have. The divided self, of course, comes back. Petrarch wants these things in 142, but back to 158, it's been 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or with Petrarch, potentially 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So now we have Petrarch's mind speaking to the soul itself. The divided self is turned into personification allegory. Che fai, alma? Che pensi? Avrem mai pace? Avrem mai tregua? Or avrem guerra eterna? Che fia di noi non so, ma in quel che io scerna, a suoi begli occhi il mal nostro non piace. Che pro, se con quegli occhi ella ne face distate un ghiaccio, un fuoco quando inverna. Ella no, ma colui che gli governa. Questo che a noi, s'ella se'l vede, tace. talor tace la lingua il cor si lagna, ad alta voce, in vista asciutta e lieta, piange, dove mirando altri non vede. Per tutto ciò la mente non s'acquetta, rompendo il duol che in lei s'accoglie e stagna, che gran speranza o misero non crede. And so the soul and the mind here, and the mind wants to know, is this just going to go on forever? I don't know. But sticking with that old thought, I hope that seeing our ills will not, I think that seeing our ills will not please her eyes. What help is that when with those eyes she makes us ice in summer and fire in winter? The contradictions continue. It's not her, but the one who rules her. What matter if she sees and yet is silent? Sometimes her tongue is silent, and her heart complains aloud. And with face dry-eyed and happy, she weeps within where no gaze can see. So the suggestion here that perhaps Laura isn't just this figure that exists only for his imagination, but has her own complexity. For all that, my mind is not at peace, aching with grief that gathers there and stays, an unhappy man's no faith in wild hopes. Ca gran speranza o misero non crede. For all of these thoughts, there still is no peace. That question of rem pace, rompendo il duol che in lei s'accoglie e stagna, aching with grief that gathers there and stays. Another one of the penitential poems that he writes, that we've seen here and there, that they're very sincere penitential poems. They're just not enough at this point to break his cycles of self-destruction, really. Or che il cielo e la terra il vento tace, le fere e gli augelli il sonno affrenna. Notte il carro stellato in giro mena, e nel suo letto il mar senza onda giace. Veglio, penso, ardo, piango. E chi mi sface sempre mena innanzi per mia dolce pena. Guerra il mio stato, dire di duol piena, e sol di lei pensando qualche pace. Così sol d'una chiara fonte viva, muove il dolce e l'amaro ond'io mi pasco. Una man sola mi risana e punge, e perché il mio martir non giunga a riva, 1000 volte il dì muro e 1000 nasco, tanto dalla salute mia son lunge. So we have all of the differences between Petrarch and the world. The world is sleeping, the wild creatures are at rest, but Petrarch is looking, thinking, burning, and weeping. The same ideas repeated again and again. Dire di duol pieno, a war that's filled with wrath and suffering. And only in thinking of her do I find peace. So from one pure living fountain flow the bitter and the sweet, from which I drink. D'una chiara fonte viva. That first canzone that we were looking at, chiare, fresche, dolce acque, pulling up those same words, the chiara fonte, the clear waters that he was speaking of before. Here we have a fonte viva, this clear water gives him both the bitterness and the sweet that he drinks from. The one hand heals him, pierces him. And every day he's dying and being reborn in all of these circuitous thoughts that we've seen. And finally, we have that last line where he looks back on all of this Tanto dalla salute mia son lunge. Because of all of this, I am so far. Salute in Italian could literally mean health, but it also means salvation, eternal health. From the real health of his soul, he is so far because of how he leads. And then again, time for a reflection on that much desired poetic glory. Se fossi stato fermo alla spelunca, laddove Apollo diventò profeta, Fiorenza avria forse oggi il suo poeta, non pur Verona e Mantova e Arunca, ma perché il mio Iaren più non s'ingiunca. Dell'umor di quel sasso altro pianeta conven chi segua, e del mio campo mieta la polle stecchi, e con la falce adunca. L'oliva è secca e rivolta altrove l'acqua che di Parnasso si deriva, per cui in alcun tempo ella fioriva. Così sventuro ver colpa mi priva d'ogni buon frutto, se l'eterno Giove della sua grazia sopra me non piove. And so here in his, with all of his classical references, Petrarch's talking about these Latin epic poems that he started and never quite finished. And he's imagining, had he stayed firmly in that cave where Apollo became a prophet, if he'd stuck with that classical world, Florence might have her poet today, which is such a loaded line because by this time Florence had her poet and it was Dante. But Petrarch's going to completely ignore that and go back to the classical world, not just Mantua, Verona, and Arunca. So he's talking about the birthplaces here of the classical Latin poets. Mantova, the home of Virgil. But since my ground no longer yields reeds, with the moisture from that rock, I must follow another star, the Altero Pianeta, that casting for a different light. That he's talking here about the Italian lyrics that he's writing. L'oliva è secca. And the olive tree is dry, the olive tree being sacred to Athena or Minerva, and the water that springs from Parnassus. And Parnassus is one of the mountains sacred to Apollo, and therefore to poetry. So faults or misfortunes will deprive me of all the finest fruits unless God pours his grace on me from above. So Petrarch really believed that his eternal fame was going to be won through the Latin poems that he was writing, that literally nobody reads today. His great work that he was crowned poet laureate for before he had even finished it, which he never really got to, which was about Africa and the Second Punic War and Scipio defeating Hannibal in Carthage. That work, which with how many 8 years in grad school in Italian studies, I never met anybody who'd actually read that work of Petrarch's. He was convinced that that's where his glory was going to come from, and that these Italian poems were just these unimportant scattered rhymes, is how he describes them. But of course, this is all anybody reads today. And we'll skip way ahead here. And we can basically just say same thing happens again and again, because that's Petrarch for us. Anima, che diverse cose tante vedi, odi, leggi, parli, scrivi e pensi. Occhi miei vaghi e tu, fra l'altri sensi, che scorgi al cor l'alte parole sante. Per quanto non vorresti, o poscio orante, esser giunti al cammin che si mal tiensi, per non trovarvi i duo bei lumi accensi, nell'orme impresse dall'amate piante. Or con sì chiara luce, con tai segni, errar non desi in quel breve viaggio, che non può far d'eterno albergo degni. Sforzati al cielo, o mio stanco coraggio, per le nebbie entro dei suoi dolci sdegni, seguendo i passi onesti, il divo raggio. And another one of the poems that comes in and just breaks up what we've had before. Spirit that sees, hears, reads, speaks, writes, and thinks so many diverse things. My eyes of longing in you among the senses that guide sacred, noble words to the heart. How much later or earlier do you wish you had taken the road that's so hard to follow, so as not to have met those two bright eyes or the steps of those beloved feet? So the regret of not having taken the camine, the path that's so hard to follow, the direct path to God, to have avoided meeting Laura's eyes, the bei lumi accensi, the two bright eyes. Now, with such clear light and so many signs, there should be no error on this brief way that makes us worthy of an eternal home. Strive towards heaven, my weary heart, through the mist of her sweet disdain, following true footsteps in divine light. So what he's doing here with Laura, the dolci sdegni, her sweet disdain, by not giving in to Petrarch, by having, and disdain is, it doesn't have a positive aspect to it, but disdain is morally the way you are supposed to feel to anything that falls short of virtue. So the sweet disdain of Laura here is the refusal to come down to Petrarch's level for this earthly love. And her disdain, keeping her away from him, refusing that earthly love. Petrarch's now taking it in this poem that the mist of her sweet disdain, la nebbia, the fog, is turning into a path towards heaven that he can follow. Seguendo I passi onesti e il divo raggio. Honest, not true footsteps, but honest footsteps there. The onesti footsteps are the footsteps of the woman who is devoted to virtue. And by being devoted to virtue, gives Petrarch a guide that he was not intending. And if there had been time, this would have been the other poem that I would have liked to have looked at here. Petrarch going over memory and what he could have done 20 years earlier. But since there isn't time, we'll note briefly 211 is one of the anniversary poems, where he gives us the explicit time of his meeting of Lara, 1327, at the beginning of the first hour on the 6th day of April, I entered the labyrinth and see no escape. So he sees her in a church on April 6th, the first hour of the day. So right at dawn. So he would have seen her there for lauds. For morning prayer. 213, this line that he has at the end, da questi magi trasformato fui. I was transformed by magic like this. That word, da trasformato, is important. Trasformato, which is just the Latin equivalent of metamorphosis, as opposed to conversion, which in the Greek metanoia. He has all of these poems about transformation that has happened to him, and all of these poems about wanting a conversion that has not yet happened. So the final poem that we're looking at today is another sestina, Anzi 3D creata era alma in parte. The 3 days that he's referring to here are the 3 stages of life: infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Anzi 3D creata era alma in parte, da por sua cura in cose altere e nove, e dispriegiar di quel che molti ne pregio. Questa ancor dubbia del fatal suo corso, sola pensando, pargoletta e sciolta, entrò di primavera in un bel bosco. Era un tenero fior nato in quel bosco, il giorno avanti, e la radice in parte capressar non poteva anima sciolta, che veren dalla lacciuol forme sì nove, e tal piacer precipitava al corso, che perder libertà ivi era in pregio. Caro dolce alto faticoso pregio, che ratto mi volgeste al verde bosco, usato di sfiarne a mezzo il corso. Ed ho cerco poi il mondo a parte, se versi o petri o succo d'erbe nove mi rendesser un dì la mente sciolta. Ma lasso or veggio che la carne sciolta fia di quel nodo, onde il suo maggior pregio prima che medicine, antiche o nove, salden le piaghe che pressi in quel bosco, folto di spine ond'io ben tal parte, che zopponesco, entravi a sì gran corso. Pien di lacci e di stecchi un duro corso, aggio a fornir, ove leggera e sciolta pianta avrebbe uopo. E sana ad ogni parte. Ma tu, Signor, c'hai di pietate il pregio, porgimi la man destra in questo bosco, vinca il tuo sole le mie tenebre nove. Guarda il mio stato alle veghezze nove, che interrompendo di mia vita il corso m'han fatto abitador d'ombroso bosco. Rendimi, s'esser può, libera e sciolta, l'errante mia consorte. E fie tu il pregio, s'ancor teco la trovo in miglior parte. Or ecco in parte la questione nove, s'alcun pregio in me vive, o in tutto è corso, o l'anima sciolta, o ritenuta al bosco. And so we have again Petrarch tormented over one of those rhyme words, the course, the corso, the path, the road that he is taking, the pregio, the prize that he's seeking. And those words, of course, should be directed towards salvation. Sholta, freed from. But literally undone like a knot. To undo a knot is to sciogliere. And that bosco, the wood that ends up being the scene so often of these memories and imagined loved meetings with Laura. And the searches here and there, everywhere, for something that can make him sheltered, something that can liberate him from this. But we'll notice he doesn't use that word, liber, for free. He hasn't come to that point yet, because to be free, liber, using one of those words, is a word that implies salvation. But as he discusses where he is, now the harsh road, pendilaci stecchi duro corso. Here he turns to God, tu Signor, cae di pietate il pregio. You that have with mercy that prize. Porgimi la man destra in questo bosco. With that the pity that you have, extend to me your hand. Vinca il tuo sole mie tenebre nove. Let your sun disperse my darkness. This new darkness. look over my state, alla veghezze nove, that noun formed off of the adjective for something that's vague, la veghezze nove. These wanderings that are alluring and seductive, that are interrupting the path of my life. Di mia vita il corso. Here you have to think of Dante's opening line, nel mezzo di cammin di nostra vita, the cammin, which is almost synonymous with corso. Midway through my life's journey, I found myself abandoned in a dark wood, which is exactly where Petrarch is finding himself here. These new seductive wanderings interrupting my life's path that have made me an habitador, one who's living in the shadowy wood. The idea here is so clearly Dantesque. But of course, Petrarch would never admit that. But he's asking for God here to liberate him from this. And now we have that verb, libera. Rendimi se serpo, libera e sciolto, l'errante mia consorte. Make my soul free. E fia tuo il pregio, let yours be the prize. Se ancor teco la trovo in miglior parte, e fia tuo il pregio, that prize that Petrarch spent his entire life chasing, that prize of glory. Let the prize that Petrarch seeks be the prize of God. If I find it at last with you in a better place, take me out of this dark wood, the tenebrae, in which Petrarch finds himself. Now here in this place, my questions ever new. Is there anything in me to prize? Is this the path? Is my soul free or imprisoned in the wood? As he turns to God and is begging for salvation. Or ecco in parte le questioni nove. And here are the new questions. If there's anything in me, salcun pregio in me vive. If any prize in me lives. And this is the place that I wanted to end on tonight. We're passing over the same ground, but the ground that we're passing over, Petrarch's desire for conversion is becoming not desperate, but increasingly important, increasingly urgent, if we can use that word with Petrarch. We're at poem 214, and there's still 152 left. So we're not quite there yet. But the desire to hand everything over to God, the sincerity of these verses, and doing this in a sestina. Again, that poetic form that lends itself towards remaining exactly where you are because the words don't change. They just go around in circles. In the last 9 lines of the stanza, wanting to break out of this. And literally that is what happens in this stanza that's about these words just being replaced. We have this desire, God, give me your right hand. Pull me out of this dark wood, this dark poetic wood that he's literally constructed within this poem. All right, thank you very much. We'll end there for tonight. Next week, we will end with the end of the first part of this. This collection of poems has wrongly been described as being in 2 parts, in Laura's life and then after Laura's death, which is just so clearly absolutely not the case. So we're going to end next week with the first poem of part 2, which does not announce Laura's death, but shows that this is, again, the portrait of a soul. Io vo pensando, poem 264, which is just one of the most beautiful poems ever written. That's where we'll end up next week, after having a few more 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So thank you very much again. If you like the slides, let me know and I'll send those on. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you next week.